Well, I think it's time to make a film about colour now. Although I've done a whole video on drawing in colour, I'll just show you the basics of colour and some of the most important facts about it: broken colour, colour intensity, colour tones and so on, the colour circle, complementary colours, and where we go from all of that. I'll do some demonstrations for you and give you the very basics then, the skeleton, the foundation. You really can't paint without a knowledge of colour and the medium. So I'll go into it in some detail and discuss all of these parts with you so that you'll hopefully have a much better understanding at the end of this film. What colours do you buy and what make or type of paints do you buy is a question I'm often asked. We really can't run before we can walk though, can we? It will depend upon the type of work you want to do, the type of subject you want to do, and the type of techniques that you want to use. Like most things, usually the more expensive, the higher quality the materials and the better they are, the more permanent the colours and so on. I would say this certainly with watercolour. Do not buy students' watercolour, only buy artist watercolour. There is no saving in buying students. They aren't the same quality, transparency, and they won't go as far. I love unison pastels and I also love the SAA pastels, so two good sets of pastels to buy there, nice and soft, good quality. And well-known makes of oil paints and acrylics are also very good. You can get away with students' quality in oils and acrylics, but you will find that the acrylics are a little bit thinner. I've just shown you here sheets and palettes of the colours that I use to give you an idea. All of these palettes will give you full use of almost every subject you can think of. But to explain this more clearly, let's now look at some of my paintings that are done in different methods and different ways and different materials to see how this would work. For instance, the FW acrylic inks are much more vibrant and stronger than watercolours. Oils are usually more intense than the acrylics. Here's an example of a demonstration I did for an art society some years ago, where I actually show the full mixture of the palettes that I use, the warm and cool greens and so on. So here you can see the importance of learning about colour. Not only the mediums we paint with and the quality of those are important, also the surface that we paint upon, whether it be paper, canvas or whatever. Here you see a watercolour paper. It's a quality watercolour paper, £140 knot. This is a smooth watercolour paper. It's a hot press watercolour paper on which watercolour pencil was used. Here I'm using pastels over acrylic inks on a knot watercolour paper, so an intermediate textured surface. And then, because I want a very rough texture for snow, I'm onto a rough paper so that I can use pencil and watercolour and pastel over each other to give the texture of snow. On this painting of the sea, I wanted a much finer canvas because I wanted to do more detailed work. Then it's onto a much larger canvas where I wanted to use spray cans and spray can art, so I wanted a much smoother surface, the same sort of canvas but many coats of primer to start with to get a much smoother surface to spray onto. Then an ordinary painting on a rougher canvas with much heavier opaque oil paint where I really built it up into a three-dimensional texture. And then you move on to an ordinary canvas where I've used gold leafing and oil pastels and melted the oil pastels on, so very different ways of working. And then next on to another more detailed work with glazing where I painted the canvas dark first of all with the black ground and then worked glazes of acrylics over the top. When I'm talking about colour and techniques, I'm also going to discuss broken colour, the impressionist use of colour, where you might mix red and yellow dots together to give the effect of orange, as I've done here. Or the opposites in the colour circle, where we might get yellow, for instance, with purple to give shadows that are much more vibrant. We need to use the colour and techniques and methods for the actual mood of the painting as well. Here I've used acrylics and then put oils over the top to get the final vibrance at the end and then the soft background colours, because we are after a time of day and an atmosphere. The use of acrylic inks, which are much brighter than watercolours. Here we use wet into wet technique to get this effect of a nighttime scene in a city. The use of mixed media as well, where I've used here tissue paper glued onto the board surface, an MDF surface, and then used acrylic inks, and then used acrylics, and then used oils at the end to get this vibrant, quite large picture using this composite of butterfly wings. A quick study here on plein air of using unison pastels on ongras paper in an ongras pad out in New Zealand. And continuing with mixed medium, here we've got acrylic inks with pastels over the top on a watercolour paper again to give a nice lively loose effect. In the next instance I was painting in the Hebrides on plein air out of doors, and I had a large piece of hot pressed smooth watercolour paper pre-primed with dark acrylic paint, and then I'm using pastels over the top of that, about half an hour in freezing cold weather. On the canvas again, this time the broken colour technique using oil paint, and just building up in little dots and dashes of colour until the painting, like a jigsaw, forms together. Atmosphere again, wet into wet watercolour up in Scotland to give the effect of these dour days of the rain coming down from hanging clouds. Again I wanted vibrancy and freshness. This is a studio work painted with acrylics and then oils over the top, gradually built up to give this vibrancy of the woman picking flowers in the garden. Back to this much softer scene with exactly the same paints, oil paints again, but painted with a different key of colours, much bluer, much cooler, to bring out the marsh effect. And then on to mixed media again, where I built up with all sorts of things from Kellogg's cornflakes to rice and peas and seeds and all sorts, using PVA glues and so on, building up a ground and different keys. So we've got the warm key, then a cool key next. We're going to discuss warm and cool colours to give totally different effects of summer and winter, and playing with texture and abstraction. To understand a bit more about how to paint and how to draw, it might be useful to know how we actually see. We see by colour and tone. If we had a totally light white room with no shadows at all and furniture in it, and there were no shadows or form, we wouldn't see anything but a white space. But as soon as we put a light in there and cause shadow, we can see around things. Pigment is just a whole mass of powder, isn't it? It is little granules of colour, and those, when they're merged together, as these dots are, begin to form a tone. So if we had print making on a newspaper and the dots were larger, as they got smaller and smaller they would blend and we'd start to get a pattern like this. And if we start to leave light and dark areas, then we start to see shapes. In other words, the eye is being fooled by these dots, as we shall see in the Impressionist technique later of broken colour. We're telling a lie, we're telling a fib, we're making an illusion of forms and three-dimensional shapes on a flat surface. Let's take this a stage further now, and you see how these lines start to actually form shapes and volume. We start to see a tubular shape. And then by adding shadows, or by adding further shapes, the mind and the eye is fooled into seeing solid forms on the surface. In doing this, we find ways of creating not only the shape of the form, but where it stands in space, whether it stands above something, whether it's on a level, as we just saw there, how much there is between the object and the surface below, whether it's a round or spherical or flat. And as we play with these different shadings on these surfaces, we also get the feeling of what material it might be too, whether it might be metal. But now I'm coming into the subject of drawing more than colour, although this is very important for our colour as well. For instance, in portraiture it's very important to have the light at the right angle to show a portrait, whether it's from in front or beside or three-quarter view, is vital to our choice of the composition. Next, it's important to understand the difference between colour intensity and tone. Here you see a painting I've done that's quite bright in colour, but when photographed everything looks much duller. The yellows, which seem very, very bright, are much duller when turned into tone. If we look at the actual colour circle and some colours below that, and then we look at that again in black and white, we'll see that colours that seem very colour intense and very bright, such as the yellows and reds, are in fact much duller when photographed in black and white. If you squint your eyes down and look at something, you'll see the thing more tonally. If you want to see more colours, have your eyes much wider. So when you squint down, you'll see the closeness of the tones. It cuts things down much more easily for you to draw and see the colours as tones. Here a painting of Beverley Minster, and just look at the way some of those brighter colours go much duller when they're in tones. This is an important thing to realise. Next we're going to go on to the properties of colour, with the primary colour, secondary and tertiary, and it goes beyond that, as you can see here. To keep this film as short as possible, I'm having to work very quickly for you, so you may have to go through it again, but I will try and be as clear as I can. In this case we're going now to talk about the armoury we have, the amount of versatility we have with colour. So we need to know about the colour circle, we need to know about complementary colours and so on. So our most important and first or primary colours are red, yellow and blue. I'm going to show you later on how we mix these to make all the other various colours. The secondary from those are going to be orange, purple and green. and then we go on to the tertiary colours after that, which will include the browns, and also I'm going to include greys in that. Within that we have the colour intensity, how strong actual colours are in pigment, how vibrant they are, how they work one to another. That means we come then into complementary colours. Now complementary colours are very much about one opposite colour to another and how they affect each other. So yellow to purple, or green to red, or blue to orange. And again, let's see how that works. I did show you this earlier with a beach painting where I had done a yellow beach and purple shadows. But if we look at the opposites of orange to blue, red to green and yellow to purple, they don't look too much just on their own like this. They look quite dull. If we want to paint somebody with a fluorescent jacket on the beach or on a road or something, then we can't use fluorescent paint. We're going to have to use colours of warms and cools and the opposites in the colour circle to work for us. Here's an example then. Here are those opposites, the complementary colours in the colour circle inside each other, and see how much more vibrant they are and give the effect of being fluorescent. This happens in nature as well, in warning signs and so on. Here's a worksheet showing that. Then we come on to the warms and the cool side, the passive range and the active range, how it's more warmer in the active range and cooler in the passive. And warm and cool colours are going to be very important as well. We go beyond that from the secondary to tertiary and quaternary and even quinary colours. But we don't need to go too much into that in depth. I'll explain when I do the actual colour mixing with you with brushes. It's important that you understand the difference between warm and cool colours as well. It's very simple. Think of ice and flame. So blues are cooler and the reds are warmer. Here you can see those colours gradually going round in the colour circle from warm to cool of almost every colour there is. In yellows there's a cooler yellow such as lemon, or a warmer yellow such as cadmium. In blues it goes more from the purples, which is the warmer colour, through to the reds, as you see here on the middle left. So you see we have cool and warms of every colour there is. And we use that in our paintings. Here you can see how I use the cool and warm effects on these snow and ice scenes of the sunlight coming through between the cool shadows to get the effects. And the colour intensity as well, of playing cools against warms and lights against darks tonally, as well as the contrast in colour. So that's the basics on tone, colour intensity and warm and cool colours. Now let's look at broken colour. If, as the Impressionists, we paint with little dots of, say, red and yellow, it will fool the eye from a distance into thinking it's blending it into orange, as we see here. This is the Impressionist technique and it's very vibrant. Colours actually do that anyway, because when we mix the pigments, those pigments are gradually mixing together to fool the eye at a much, much smaller range, because they're very, very fine then. So the larger the dots, the less the eye is fooled, and the smaller the dots together, as in pointillism, the closer they come together and therefore fool the eye into making a mix. We can do that with lines as well. Here's a crosshatch piece in pastel, which is almost pointillist or impressionist because the colours are blending. Next we look at just how a few colours can be made to work rather than the whole palette full. Here we have a limited palette of earth colours. We have yellow ochre, burnt sienna, black, burnt umber and raw umber. And how even the burnt umber and the raw umber are very different. The burnt umber, being burnt, is much warmer and the raw umber much greener. And by using those we can fool the eye into thinking that they're much stronger colours like the ones below. In other words, when used just on their own and relevant one to another, they will appear as bright as those colours below. Here's a painting where I've used this limited earth palette and shown the colours next to the actual painting so you can see how it works. It's very subtle, and of course if we can make a painting work with very subtle colours, if we then add much stronger ones later, imagine how vibrant they would be. This is when I come back to that business of somebody with a fluorescent coat. If I now put cadmium red into that, it would look extremely bright and change all of the values. We can also work towards the power of a colour. Here are some computer illustrations showing how the same scene can be biased towards one colour, whether it be yellows or greens or browns, and how you can make very different atmospheres this way by just using almost one colour in different tones or variations. To add to our armoury, we don't only have tone and colour, we also have texture and pattern, and look how nature uses that as well. We could build up our canvas or our surface, as I've shown you earlier in some of my art examples, with filler, or we can even use the paint as impasto, painting it very, very thickly on top to go with the forms and to help form actual three-dimensional shapes on the canvas and build it out slightly. This will even help our colour and drawing. You can see how nature camouflages things by using pattern or by using similar colours, as we have here in this worksheet. And I'm going to discuss how to paint shiny objects gold and silver later. Although we have our three primary colours, it's virtually impossible to mix all of the colours you want from those basic primaries. There are some colours that you simply won't be able to mix directly from those three primaries, such as the violets, the cobalt violets and the turquoise and so on. Once you have these bright colours purchased that have been pre-mixed, then you'll be able to make brighter colours from those, yes. Most colours we can work from our basic palette, but you will have to buy some pre-mixed. In the same way that different makes of colour will also differ when you mix them. And not only will different makes of colour change in mixing, but the different types of colour. So watercolour will mix quite differently to acrylic, which often mixes very differently to oil paint, and the different types of those will also change. So it's quite complicated. All I can do here so quickly is try and give you a basic understanding about the colours, and then you'll be able to watch my other films in more detail. Okay, let's start working directly about colour. So we've talked now about having primary colours, secondary colours, tertiary colours, then we go down to quaternary colours and quinary colours even. Our main concern at the moment is just with these three primaries which we're going to mix into secondaries. So anything that's made from these three, remember we cannot make these three, we can only adjust the colour tones or hues of them. So we can't make these, we can make other colours from these, all the other colours can come from these. But certain colours will need a certain variation of these colours. So a particular type of blue is made commercially with chemicals, which we cannot get the effect of just with this or that by mixing them. So there are certain colours like cobalt violet, for instance, which we just can't make. It can only be made by a chemical process, and then we can use them afterwards. But I shall be going into that in more detail. So here we go then. If we start taking these and adding them to make the secondary colours, so if I take the lighter colour first, it's always the wisest thing to do, and I add that there, and I put a little bit of red with that, it turns it into orange. We've already talked about broken colour. Now, if I take the yellow again, and this time add, so there's our first secondary colour. If I take the yellow again and add some blue to that, I'll get a green. It's a very nice green, but I get a green. These are acrylics that I'm using. And the different yellows and different reds and different blues that we have will give us totally different greens and secondary colours and so on. So there we have a green tint coming. Add more blue to it, it gets bluer. And usually getting bluer means it gets cooler, and getting more red becomes warmer. Add more and more and more. You'll see we get a more of an effect of a green. I'm going to deliberately show you some of these other colours to mix in a minute. Now we'll try and make a purple, and it's not easy making a purple. It depends what red and blues we've got. So usually we need to rely on the tubes from the colours from the tubes to make something like a purple or a mauve. But if we take blue and a little bit of red, then we'll get a mauve effect. Look, there's our mauve. So there's just some of our secondary colours. Now, if we mix all three, we should get a brown. So if I take all of these, red, blue, and a bit of yellow, then I will get a brown depending on the mixtures that I make. And there's a sort of brown colour coming now. And that will also depend, and very similar to the mixtures of those secondary colours already made. So therefore if I mix orange and blue I should get brown. If I mix orange and green I should get a brown, and so on. And to say depending upon the red and depending upon the blue that you're using as to how brown it's going to be. So you can see a type of brown coming there, rather reddy brown, a bit more yellow perhaps. And that will give us our browns. Now I think for making greys, one of our best ways is to add blue and brown together with white, rather than using black. I'll demonstrate what I mean. Right, I've now added to my palette here. I've got some black and some white here, and I have some Prussian blue over here. Now if I just use the black, you can see it's very flat and very dark, and a little bit of white to that, and we'll start to make some grey. And look, just look how sooty that grey is. Now if I want to make darks normally, I tend to mix colours, because in my view as an impressionist, wherever there is light there has to be some colour, because the light will be blue light or pink light or whatever, and even white or black will then be reflecting that colour, and it'll be a darker shade of the colour or lighter shade of the colour or whatever. Anyway, by the by, let's take some of the deepest blue here, the Prussian blue. It should be even darker in oil paint. These acrylics are a little bit lighter, and I'm going to add a little bit of warm to that. So I'm going to come down to my palette now and add a little bit of this umber here, this burnt umber, to it, and look how dark that makes it. It's almost the same as the black, but it's much more vibrant. So a bit more brown, and I can go a warmer black, and more blue, and it stays a cooler black. Right, there we are. Look, there's the black and there's the more vibrant one. Now if I add some white to that, then we can get a nice cool grey. And if I want to put some more brown to it, I can make it into a warmer grey. If I wanted to tint the colour, you see how much cooler that is than this one now. I can add more warm to it to make a warmer grey. And we start to just think about how many greys we could make, because with the variety of the whole palette, with all my various blues and browns and other tints, we could make a whole variety of different greys just with the deepest blues or blues and a brown. Let's see what we get with the cobalt blue and a little bit of the brown. And as I say, in oil paints the colours are much stronger, so this would be working better. Let's see how dark we go with that. Still very dark. Add some white to it, and we start to get a nice warm grey there. So a different grey again. Isn't far off that one. If I wanted it a bit warmer, I could add a bit more. And also remember, of course, that a little bit of red into it now, look. And that's very close to that grey. So that black, in fact, is a very warm colour, very warm grey. Now the greys can be made then with almost any variation of the three secondary colours, the brown and the blue basically, because it's three colours to make the brown, red, yellow and blue, but with a little bit more blue and white we turn it into a grey. So with the deepest blues and your browns you can make some beautiful greys. There are other ways as well. I'm just going to show you now, as near as I can do it, that you can use something like alizarin crimson and viridian green to make a wonderful grey as well. Let's just see if it'll do it with these acrylics. It is a different green, it's not quite as dark as viridian, and different red. We'll just see. Blend that into there. You see we're getting a lovely rich grey, purple grey coming already. Now with that some white, and look at that beautiful grey we get there. Very greeny grey. You can see the difference in all of these greys across now. And by adding more viridian or more alizarin I could change that grey to warmer or cooler. So we can work from very, very cool greys. If I say this one again, let's take our brown and blue again. Take the blue and a little bit of the brown, and we're going to make a much bluer grey this time with far more blue into it. You see the very blue grey we get there now. So we can have a variation for your skies of all these different sorts of greys by using red, yellow and blue to adjust your greys with white, not the black. I'm not saying black doesn't have a place, and we're discussing that with a limited palette. Now greens, such a variety of different greens. We've already seen that green is being made from blue and yellow. If we just take a couple of palette greens here, look at that beautiful bright one there, then this deeper one we were using just now there, then there's a turquoise green here, then we come down to the blues. And if I were to use the man-made blues with the yellows, let's just see what happens with that. I'm going to take a stroke of lemon yellow right across here, I'm going to just mix into that some of these different blues. Here's some cerulean mixed in with it, which makes you a lovely light bluey green. Take the next blue down, which is the cobalt we've just been using. That gives me this one, much more bluey green. We'll take some ultramarine now and mix that in. Gives me a really blue green. And now we'll take some of that Prussian blue. Look at that depth. And we can start to make things warmer. I'll take now a different yellow. Let's take some chrome yellow, come across. This is a much warmer yellow. And we'll do the same thing. Take a little bit of that cerulean blue. And a much, much warmer green is being achieved. Up next to our cobalt again. And then to our ultramarine. You can see the difference in that. Won't bother with the Prussian. Now I'm going to go to a much warmer yellow still. To take some yellow ochre. This acrylic paint is a bit jelly-like, but it's doing the job just to show us what's happening. So some yellow ochre. And we'll mix the blue into that. We'll take the cerulean first of all. Gives us a very, very warm green, almost a browny green. Then we'll take some cobalt. Then we'll take some ultramarine. And then we'll take some Prussian finally. And we could warm those up with the addition of browns or whatever to make even warmer green still. For that purpose I'll take a little raw umber, not burnt umber, because the raw umber is greener anyway, and I'll add a little bit of raw umber to that to make it even warmer. And look at that lovely brown green we're getting now. So there's a variation of those, equally the other way round. We could go more turquoise. So if I take some turquoise now here, I add some yellow to that, could have done it the other way around. Look at that beautiful green I get with that, a little bit of white. And we get these beautiful turquoise greens. And if you can't quite see that, then I'll put some very light cerulean next to it, and look how turquoise that is, how green that is. You can see it by comparison then. So there we have the primary colours, the secondary colours, and now we're working into the tertiary colours, which will be the purples, the browns and the different greens. Beyond that we go into the quaternary and the quinary, and then we're going to plum greys, plums, buffs, grey browns and so on. Basic colour making. So let's go back to that example I gave where I used different warm and cool greens and the varieties of blues as well. And now you'll understand it perhaps more clearly. You can see here the mixtures of greens that I've done and the varieties of browns, and how I've used those warm and cool colours together on this scene to get the effect of light and vibrancy shining through this Scottish woodland. Then we talked about the complementary colours and how one colour affects another. How red looks brighter next to green, how blue looks brighter next to orange, how purple looks brighter next to yellow. We'll just do that, even though I've shown it to you in graphics already. If I take some yellow for a beach, and I then paint some purple in, some purple shadow. So I'll take a bit of purple now and just put that next to it, and even a bit into it. And look how much brighter that makes not only the purple look when it was separate to within the yellow, but it makes the yellow look brighter as well. Now we'll take some green, just like Constable. You'd nearly always have a little red figure somewhere in the painting to make the green look greener and the red look brighter. A little bit of deep green down here. We'll take a little touch of red and then some orange. And we'll just put that again next to it here, so you see the difference. And then in it here, look how bright that red looks. Take a little bit of orange, we'll put that in there, which is even warmer still. And you see the brightness of that compared to the green. So we'll take some blue next. Those are opposites, our complementary colours. And into that blue we'll place a bit of orange. Just a splash of orange there. It's not going on very purely, that's better. And see how bright that looks against the blue. It's by this that we're able to play warm against cools, light against darks, roughs against smooth with texture as well. Use colour intensity and use complementary colours to make the colours really work for us and give us dull days, bright days, vibrancy, any atmosphere and mood we need. We do need to understand the colours and how to use them. So you've learnt now how to make browns, how to make greens, how to make greys, the complementary colours, the primaries and the secondaries. So imagine the variety of colours that we can have. I mean, if we now look back at my palette, it's rather a messy one here, and we say how could we make various greys there? If we said we're going to make brown with the red, yellow and blue, and look how many blues we've got and variations of blues, and how many reds and how many yellows, and the variations of the browns and the blue, grey, browns that we can make, or colours we can make, and then add white to make a whole plethora of different greys. There's just one more little trick I wanted to show you, and that is when we talked about black. Actually, black can make quite a nice green. I'll take some yellow there and just add a little bit of that black to it, and it will give me a slightly greeny tint. Rather mucky one, because black does make things sooty. It doesn't look very green compared to that, but it is, and especially in oil paint, it is very slightly green. Amongst the questions I get asked so often are, what colours do I use for a certain purpose? How do I make gold? How do I make silver? How do I make flesh colours? How do I make sand? How do I make skies? There's no one simple answer to that, because each effect of light will be a different set of colours. The flesh will be reflecting colours around it. If there's flowers underneath somebody's face, they'll be reflecting on the skin, and so on, a bit like they say about buttercups and shiny yellow skin. So one colour affects another, and it's the effect of light that you want as well. Whether you want a very low-key palette, whether you want a very dull day, whether you want a very bright sunny day. If it's a bright sunny day, then as you see here, the tones are much further apart. We have much darker tones and lighter tones for a very bright sunny day. On a soft cloudy day, then the tones are being much closer and much duller. I tend to paint about the time of day, the moment, the mood, the atmosphere, so I tend to choose different palettes and different sets of colours for each different painting. And in landscape I try and choose the palette to suit the landscape and the place that I am, so that Bridlington would look very different to painting in the south of France, or in Quebec or wherever. Each place will have its own set of colours and own values, and we'll get the atmosphere of the actual place. I remember one professional artist who worked up in Whitby liked his work very much, and the work reflected the light and colour and atmosphere of Whitby. But when I saw his paintings done across in Italy and in Venice and so on, the light was exactly the same, the palette was exactly the same, and I wouldn't have known it wasn't painted, apart from the images, in Whitby. A shame. So I hope that these images I'm now showing you of my past work give you an idea of how we can use tone and colour, the warms and the cools and the textures, to give the effect and vibrance that we want, and to capture that moment in time in both portrait and landscape, here and abroad. Now back to your question about vibrant colours, silvers and golds, and how to get the effect of fluorescence. Here you see with the eyes those very strong warm colours painted against the cools, and the opposites going on there. How to get the effect of gold and silver here in my book illustrations and so on. Let me explain to you and show you a few examples of how we might get that. The organ pipes in the distance here is another example. Here we have a little setup, a still life setup, with gold and silver in it, and there's the tones of it. Now if we take those tones back into a drawing, then we need to take them into painting. We look at the cools and warms, how much warmer the brass is than the silver, which is much more greys and blues. And if we actually separate those colours out more, you can see just how those blues are more silver and the yellows and the oranges and the golds are more the brass and the bronze. To explain it a bit more clearly, let's look at the warms and cools here. Here we have the warmer colours of maybe brass or bronze. Like glass, these metallic things are reflecting the light around them, but the reflections will usually be a bit warmer. When we come to the cooler ones, for instance, though, there we have just the greys, we come to the blues and the greys, you'll find that the warmer colours are much cooler and the reflections are cooler still. So here we have all of the colour circle, but with a much cooler hue. We tend to find that in silvers all of the colours are a much cooler hue, and you see in the background here the toaster and so on, we've got those blues that we've just been showing you there. One of the most important things that I think I keep teaching in my videos is that you use my jigsaw method, that you put the right colours in the right shapes in the right places relevant one to another. If you do this, it doesn't matter what you're painting, whether it be glass, whether it be fish, whether it be horses, the thing will just appear. If you get the right colours in the right drawing shapes relevant one to another, these objects will just appear and become landscape, fish, horse, person, whatever. Don't treat things differently unless you have a particular need to. There are times when it is good. So here in this case I'll show you examples of my painting water, reflection, surfaces and glass and so on, using that method, but using different techniques as here with the watercolour. My tips for painting water is that with a smooth surface water you paint the depth of the water first. You paint the vertical strokes, look at the depth into the water and the reflections, and then paint the surfaces on afterwards, the horizontal strokes. This requires a bit more planning ahead, especially in watercolour, where you may have to get the reflections, the horizontal reflections, dealt with first with dry brushwork. Well, I hope this short video and this instruction has been enough to give you a much clearer idea and help you with your understanding of colour. I hope it will also help you in making much stronger and more exciting paintings and finding ways to improve and explore and experiment and really enjoy what you're doing.